I was sitting in my cozy home on New Year's Eve. Snow was falling gently, covering the streets with a white blanket. Streetlights cast a warm, diffused glow that reflected off the snow, creating a magical atmosphere. The road, nearly invisible beneath the thick layer of snow, bore only a few scattered tire tracks. Everything around seemed perfectly quiet and peaceful. Inside, it was warm and snug. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the room with a sense of safe comfort. I was enjoying a new game on the TV, though my thoughts occasionally wandered to the anticipation of welcoming the new year. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the street, almost deserted and tranquil. Everything changed when I noticed a man repeatedly walking past my house. He looked to be around 40. Tall and slender, he wore a long dark coat that almost brushed the ground. A deep, oversized hood obscured his face entirely. His gait was steady and confident but felt oddly mechanical, as if he were walking the same path repeatedly for no discernible reason. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone or just out for a stroll, but as time passed, his strange pacing continued. He didn't stop or veer into the yards of neighboring houses, he just repeated the same steps over and over. Glancing at the clock, I realized that more than half an hour had passed. My curiosity turned into unease. Something about the man unsettled me. I turned off the TV, approached the window, and slightly lifted the curtain to avoid being seen. The man was now standing with his back to my house. His shoulders were slightly hunched, as if from the cold or tension. But what really caught my attention were his hands. They were in his coat pockets, but the gloves he wore were wet. Even in the dim glow of the streetlight, I could see they were stained with something dark, resembling blood. A wave of anxiety swept over me. I couldn't take my eyes off him, though he stood still, like a statue. It felt as though he was waiting for someone, or stalking them. My gaze was fixed on him when another figure appeared on the street. It was a man carrying grocery bags, likely on his way home. He looked tired, his step slow, his face dimly lit by the faint shimmer of moonlight. The stranger in the coat seemed not to notice him at first, but as soon as the man passed by, the stranger began to follow. An unsettling feeling crept over me. The stranger moved so quietly that he blended into the snowy landscape. I realized this wasn't a coincidence. Something was wrong. Quickly dialing the police, I whispered a description of the situation, all while keeping my eyes glued to the stranger in the coat. The man with the grocery bags reached his house, setting them down on the porch and pulling out his keys to unlock the door. The stranger froze for a moment, then swiftly moved to the back of the house, disappearing behind the trees in the backyard. My heart raced wildly. I strained to see what was happening, but the night and distance made it difficult. When the man with the groceries entered his house and turned on a light upstairs, I finally spotted the stranger again. He was inside. On the first floor, his dark figure emerged. In his hand, he held a knife, and his shadow, distorted by the light from the hallway, appeared even more menacing. He was ascending the stairs, step by step, slowly and deliberately. My pulse pounded. I could hear the sirens of the police growing louder as they approached, but would they arrive in time? My body tensed, and a mixture of terror and helplessness overwhelmed me. Scenarios of what might happen next flooded my mind, and all I could do was hope that help would come before it was too late. The police arrived faster than I had expected. The blue and red flashing lights flooded my street, reflecting off the snowy roads and trees. Several officers jumped out of the cars and, without wasting a second, rushed toward the house. I watched as they cautiously circled the house, keeping their weapons ready. I could only watch. My heart was racing, and I was almost gasping for air from the excitement. Within minutes, I heard the police commands. Get on the floor. Hands up. There was a struggle inside the house, but it didn't last long. The stranger was quickly subdued. 2 officers escorted him outside, his hands cuffed behind his back. Now I could see his face, pale, exhausted, with a vacant, chilling stare. The gloves and the knife they found on him were stained with blood, almost black in the flickering light of the street lamps. One of the officers approached my house. "Are you okay? We received your call," he asked. "Yes, I'm just." "It was terrifying," I said, barely holding back the tremor in my voice. The officer reassured me that everything was under control now and asked me to return to my house. I followed his request, but falling asleep that night was impossible. The scenes I had just witnessed kept replaying in my mind. The next morning, when I opened the news on my phone, I saw headlines that made me hold my breath. It turned out that the man they had arrested was a serial killer. He was suspected of having murdered at least 10 people in various cities. The article stated that he randomly chose his victims, usually those who appeared vulnerable. A wave of horror washed over me as I realized how close danger had been to me and my neighbors. But at the same time, I felt a sense of relief. Perhaps my call had helped prevent another tragedy. The winter night was bitterly cold, and the snowstorm that had started a few hours ago now blanketed the entire highway. The snowflakes were falling thick and fast, swirling around like ghosts, and visibility was next to nothing. The road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the blur of white. I had been driving for hours, hoping to make it to the next town, but the snowstorm had other plans. I had been driving alone, a decision I would soon regret. My phone had lost signal an hour ago, and I couldn't help but feel increasingly isolated. The headlights barely cut through the swirling snow, and the road, which had seemed so familiar just a few days ago, now felt like a maze with no end. The heater in my car was on full blast, but the cold seemed to seep into my bones anyway. My thoughts started to drift as the monotony of the road and the storm lulled me into a trance. That's when I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, almost completely covered by the snow, as if they had been waiting for me. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks. I had seen shadows in the snow, I told myself. It was nothing. But as I got closer, I saw it more clearly, a person, hunched over, with a strange, almost unnatural stillness. My heart skipped a beat. No one should be out here, especially not in this storm. I slowed the car down, trying to figure out if they needed help. As I rolled the window down just a crack to ask if they were okay, the figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. Instead, I noticed something odd. Their clothes were almost too perfect, as if freshly worn, with no sign of snow or cold. I shivered, but not from the weather. Something was wrong. I should have driven past, should have kept going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to help. Maybe they were stranded, lost like me. I pulled over slowly, the snow crunching under my tires as I came to a stop. The figure didn't move. I got out of the car, despite every instinct telling me not to. The wind was biting, and the snow stung my face. I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" No answer. Just that eerie, still silence. I took a few steps toward the figure, feeling the tension in my chest tightening with each step. As I got closer, I could finally see the person's face, or rather, I could see where their face should have been. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty, pale void. My blood ran cold, and for a moment, I was frozen in place, paralyzed by sheer terror. And then, as if sensing my fear, the figure moved, not towards me, but slowly backward, vanishing into the blizzard without a sound. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to run, but my feet were like lead. I turned to head back to my car, but when I looked, it was gone. The snow had covered the tracks, and the road seemed endless. There was no sign of my car, no sign of where I had parked. I was alone on the highway, with nothing but the howling wind and the strange figure that had now disappeared into the storm. A voice whispered in the back of my mind, "You're not alone." I spun around, heart pounding. There, further down the road, the figure was waiting for me again, motionless, facing me with that same hollow face. And this time, it wasn't the storm that blocked my view, it was something darker, something that had come from the depths of the snow itself. I turned to run but found myself caught in a wall of cold, as if the snow had turned to ice around me. My feet felt heavy, my body frozen in place. The voice was louder now, clearer, closer, but still far away. "You shouldn't have stopped." And just like that, the world went black. I woke up with a sharp gasp, my breath shallow and quick. For a moment, I thought I was back in the car, the warmth of the heater around me, but as I opened my eyes, I realized the truth: I wasn't in my car anymore. The snowstorm had intensified, but I was no longer on the highway. The road was gone, replaced by a dark, thick forest. The trees around me were heavy with snow, their branches bent low, groaning under the weight of the storm. I looked around in a panic, but there was no sign of my car, northwest sign of any road. Only the cold and the endless forest. I stood up, feeling an icy chill seep into my bones. My feet sunk into the thick snow as I struggled to get my bearings. The air smelled damp and sharp, but something else lingered underneath, a strange, metallic scent that I couldn't place. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stumbled forward, looking for any sign of life or a way out. But the forest seemed endless, each step taking me further into its depths, deeper into the unnatural silence. The trees were too close together, their twisted trunks and gnarled branches creating an almost suffocating barrier, making it impossible to see anything beyond the next line of trees. Then, I heard it. A soft whisper, like a breeze through the trees, but unmistakably a voice. The words were faint, just a murmur at first, but they seemed to carry an eerie weight, a cold promise. It was my name, spoken by someone who sounded too close, too real. "Come closer." The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was like a memory I couldn't fully recall, a sound from a dream that never fully formed. But I could feel it pulling me, as if the very forest itself was urging me forward. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, my legs moved. My mind numbed, and my body obeyed, as if the voice was no longer asking me to come closer, it was commanding me. I trudged through the snow, my boots sinking with each step, the whisper growing louder, closer. The path narrowed, the trees crowding in around me until there was barely any space to move. The whisper now felt like it was right next to my ear, like it was coming from behind me, though when I turned, there was no one there. Just darkness and snow. My pulse raced, but my feet carried me onward, as though they had a will of their own. Suddenly, I burst into a clearing, and for the first time, I saw someone, standing in the center. It was a figure, tall and thin, shrouded in a cloak made of shadow and snow. The figure turned slowly, and I saw the hollow face, that same void where a face should have been, staring at me. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice cold as the wind that howled through the trees. My legs froze in place, but I couldn't look away. The figure raised its arms, and as it did, the trees around the clearing began to shift. The ground seemed to tremble beneath my feet, and the whispering voices grew louder, swirling around me like 1,000 lost souls. The trees began to move, slowly at first, like they were stretching, waking up from a long slumber. But then they began to bend in unnatural ways, their roots twisting and pulling from the earth. The snow around me turned to ice, sharp and biting, and the air grew colder, colder than anything I had ever felt. And then, the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just the figure. The forest itself was speaking. "You are part of the storm now." The words hit me like a wave, crashing over me. My body shook, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I would lose myself to the dark emptiness around me. But then I heard another sound. A faint, distant sound, like a car engine struggling to start. My mind grasped onto it, something, anything, to hold onto. I turned in the direction of the sound, feeling the cold ice underfoot, and started to run. I ran through the forest, not knowing where I was going, but driven by the sound of the engine, by the desperate hope that something, was out there, that the road I had lost was still there. Waiting for me. The snow stormed around me, and the whispers followed, chasing me, but the sound of the car grew louder. I ran faster, my legs aching with exhaustion, the cold seeping deeper into my skin. I broke through the trees, and there it was, a car, parked at the edge of the forest, headlights shining through the storm. A woman stood by it, her face hidden by the hood of her coat, her body rigid, staring at the road ahead. I stumbled towards her, gasping for air, but as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The woman's face, hollow, dark, just like the figure in the forest. The same empty, soulless void. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman turned slowly, her eyes locking with mine. "You shouldn't have come," she said. The words were the same, but now they felt different. Final. I turned to run, but the snow was closing in around me again. The darkness, the cold, it was all-consuming, and I was trapped, just like those before me. As the world around me began to fade, the last thing I heard was the voice, clear as ever. "You are part of the storm now." And then, everything went black. I woke up again, but this time, the air felt heavier, thicker. I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming or if the nightmare had become my reality. The cold was biting, the ground beneath me hard and unyielding, like ice. I struggled to sit up, the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down on my chest. The woman with the hollow face was gone. The car was gone. The storm, too, had faded into a cold silence, but something remained, something ominous. I rubbed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. My surroundings were different now. I was no longer in the forest, but neither was I in any place I recognized. It was an abandoned street, lined with old, decaying buildings. The windows were shattered, their frames rotting away, and the streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. The world felt wrong, twisted, as if the very fabric of time and space had been distorted. The buildings loomed over me, their dark silhouettes pressing in on all sides. There were no cars, no signs of life. Just an eerie emptiness. The kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. I stood up, every muscle in my body protesting, and started walking. My steps echoed against the broken street. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, but the chilling sense of dread told me that I wasn't supposed to be here. Whatever this place was, it was wrong. It was as if I had stepped into a space outside of reality, and every corner was whispering my name, calling me deeper into its grip. I turned a corner, and suddenly, I was back in the forest. But this wasn't the same forest. It felt darker, colder, the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sky above was black, the stars barely visible, as if something had blocked out the natural light. I tried to backtrack, but the path had vanished. The snow, once soft and powdery, now felt like ice shards beneath my feet. Each step I took was muffled, as though the ground was absorbing my movements, making it harder for me to escape. The whispering voices from before returned, but this time, they were louder, closer, like they were right behind me. I quickened my pace, panic rising in my chest. The trees seemed to close in on me, narrowing my escape, and in the distance, I saw a figure. It was the same tall, shadowy form I had seen earlier, its face hidden in darkness. It was standing motionless, waiting for me. "Come closer." The voice from the figure slithered through the air, smooth and hypnotic. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own, drawn to the figure, compelled by something I couldn't explain. As I approached, the figure turned, its hollow face now visible, just a deep void where a face should be, endless darkness. A strange chill ran through me, and my throat tightened. It wasn't just a figure. It was something older, something ancient. And it knew me. "You shouldn't have come," it said again, its voice cold and distant, like the wind itself was speaking through it. I tried to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as though I was frozen in place, trapped in the moment, unable to move. The figure stepped closer, its presence heavy in the air. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming, until they drowned out everything else. Then, I heard something. A soft creaking sound, like a door opening. I glanced to the side and saw a faint light flickering in the distance, breaking through the dense fog of the forest. A house. A small, dilapidated cabin, its windows glowing with the dim light. It seemed out of place in the middle of the dark forest, but there was something about it that felt safe. Like it was the only thing that could break the hold of this nightmare. Without thinking, I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward the cabin, the figure's hollow eyes following my every step. I reached the door and, without hesitation, pushed it open. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. It smelled like wood and fire, and I saw a fireplace crackling in the corner, casting a soft, golden light across the room. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished, but it felt like a refuge from the cold emptiness outside. But as I stepped further into the room, something felt wrong. The warmth of the fire didn't comfort me. It felt off. Like it was drawing me in, feeding on my fear. I turned, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but there was nothing there. Just the silence. I reached out to touch the fireplace, and as my fingers brushed the wood, I felt a sudden surge of cold shoot up my arm. The fire flickered and died, leaving only a dying ember. My heart raced as I looked around the room, realizing I wasn't alone. From the corner of the cabin, a shadow emerged. A figure, barely visible in the low light, stepped forward. It was the woman, the one I had seen before, with the hollow face. She was standing in the corner, her eyes locked onto me. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice like ice scraping against stone. I backed away, but there was no escape. The door had closed behind me, and the room seemed to close in on itself, walls stretching and bending in impossible ways. The whispers returned, louder now, drowning out everything. The figure in the corner raised a hand, and everything around me went dark. The shadows swallowed the light, and I was left in complete, suffocating darkness. "You are part of the storm now." And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't just lost in a forest. I wasn't just wandering through nightmares. I had become part of something much bigger, something that would never let me leave. The darkness seemed endless, a suffocating weight pressing on my chest, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure, the woman with the hollow face, slowly advanced toward me, her presence like a cold, invisible force. I tried to move, but my limbs were frozen, unwilling to obey, trapped in the nightmare. Then, suddenly, a light appeared. A faint glow, soft and distant, like the flicker of a candle. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pierce the darkness and provide a glimpse of something real. The woman's figure faltered, her form distorting like smoke in the wind. "Run!" a voice shouted. It wasn't the woman's voice, but a deep, guttural sound that filled the space around me. I couldn't see where the voice came from, but something inside me snapped. I could feel the walls pressing in, the weight of the shadows, and I knew that if I didn't escape now, I'd be lost forever. With every ounce of strength I could summon, I pushed myself forward, stumbling toward the light. The floor beneath me seemed to shift and warp, the cabin warping into something unrecognizable. But I couldn't stop. I had to reach that light. As I got closer, I saw the doorway again, and beyond it, the dense fog of the forest. I was almost there. The woman's voice hissed from the darkness behind me, but it was too late. With one final push, I broke through the door and into the cold, biting air of the forest. The light from the cabin faded behind me, and the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. But I wasn't free. I could still hear the whispers, the distant calls from the forest that seemed to follow me, pulling me back. I ran. The cold air bit at my face, and the snow crunched underfoot, but I didn't stop. The storm had returned, swirling around me, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. But I pushed on, driven by a primal fear. Every time I turned, I felt as though the shadows were closing in, chasing me, but I didn't look back. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a road. The lights of a distant car flickered through the mist. I waved my arms desperately, and the car slowed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The door swung open, and I was pulled inside. The driver, a middle-aged man with a tired face, looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. I don't know," I gasped. I was lost. In the forest. There was something chasing me. The driver didn't seem to understand, but he kept his eyes on the road, glancing at me nervously. The snow was falling harder now, and the storm raged outside, but I was safe. I was finally getting away. But just as the car began to pick up speed, I saw something in the rearview mirror. The mist shifted, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the woman's face. Hollow. Empty. Her eyes locked onto mine. And then she was gone. I looked away, heart pounding, but I could still feel her presence, like a cold hand on my shoulder, like a whisper in my ear. The car sped on, the road ahead now clear, but I knew it wasn't over. I had escaped the forest, the cabin, and the nightmare, but it wasn't finished with me. It would never be finished.